Hello and welcome. In this video what we're going to be looking at is we're going to be looking at the poetry of John Donne, but also we're going to be looking at the ways that you would analyse and interpret his poetry. Now, when you're looking at Donne's poetry, the hardest thing, and it's one of the hardest things to study in English because of the fact that these poems are so layered and so dense, but also it doesn't really help that the poems were also written over 400 years ago. And so what you've got is language which is written in a 16th/early 17th century style, which is often quite difficult to interpret. And certainly it's one where you actually have to sort of translate it into modern day English before you can really proceed and go into the poem any more deeply than that. It is one which uses a lot of spiritual and religious metaphor, particularly ideas which have since some of which have changed quite significantly, particularly this idea of, for instance, the spheres, this idea of the Earth being the center of the universe, the planets and the sun going around it. This idea of certainly attitudes towards women, towards God, is something that probably isn't seen in such a sort of way now. So all of these ideas are ones which are almost completely foreign to us. However, this idea of love, and particularly this idea of this romance and this romantic notion of death, is one which indeed has probably aged quite well, and is one of those ones where you look at his variety of language, his use of analogy and metaphor, and once you start to really break it down, that's when you'll start to really get the idea behind it. Now, I'm certainly not saying Donne's poetry is certainly something that you'll enjoy, and definitely it's not for everyone, and I know when I studied it personally I absolutely hated it. But the thing that makes Donne's poetry special is the fact that it uses language in very inventive sorts of ways, and to be able to criticise this use of invention, and certainly the way that Donne structures things is quite archaic and quite chaotic, you can certainly then go into interpreting it, and certainly this will help you interpret other poems and other works by different authors a lot more easily. Certainly Donne is a challenge and the hardest mountain to climb, but once you've climbed it, it's much easier. And that's basically the main difficulties I guess you'll come across with studying these poems. And this this video will focus on some of the more common elements of his poetry. So when you're looking at this idea of particularly the metaphysical, and we'll go through that idea a little bit in a moment, but also these ideas of what makes him, and certainly what he tries to express through his poetry. And his poetry is quite personal in a number of ways. And indeed, Donne's movement of poetry, this metaphysical movement of poetry, is one that breaks away from the traditional Elizabethan forms and makes it more personal, and certainly gives it... These are not poems written for anyone else apart from a very small group. These are poems which are written almost entirely to reflect his own life. And even though he does use personas, and certainly the character he uses is not always necessarily himself, there is a sense that he doesn't write for structure or formal purpose. He simply writes because he likes to express himself in many deep ways. So let's look at some ideas, and particularly the first one, which comes through a lot of his early work, is man versus the divines. Now, I wouldn't necessarily say, in fact I definitely wouldn't say that he's a man who, I guess, is resisting his faith. However, he is one who likes to toy with the idea of divine forces, and particularly those which cause fear, those which his faith allow him to conquer, are ones which he sort of mocks and certainly satirises particularly a lot in his poetry. So satires like the sun rising and death be not proud, he's mocking them as almost if they're slaves to him. And this is almost in a sense to say that they're not as powerful. In the case of the sun rising, it's because of the fact that he's found something more important, which is he's found love. So to have those two together is a way to sort of say that he's one person who can hold the divines in contempt to an extent. He doesn't hold God in contempt. He never would hold God in contempt. However, he uses his faith as a way to justify being able to toy with the divines a little bit. And they are written with a sort of mischievous persona, one who, I guess, is a sort of like a schoolyard bully. He teases and taunts a bit. And through this combination of sort of, I guess, what you would call satire, as well as his own divine and spiritual ideas and his own ideas and belonging, we certainly get this idea of someone who, because of the fact that he is attuned to his faith and that he does believe, he believes that he can, through his faith, be able to conquer things such as death, such as even the sun rising in the morning. If poisonous minerals, on the other hand, is probably a more personal challenge to God. Now, that's not, again, to say that he's holding God in contempt. It's more about the nature of sin, and certainly, I guess, a sense of frustration. He's a man who is about humility and repentance, and this is a theme that's commonly repeated for a lot of his poetry. And certainly, his later poetry, one's written beyond the point when he was married, the point where he became a minister in the church. He is certainly a poet who is now a lot more, I guess, in tune with trying to get forgiveness, get repentance, be able to find his way to heaven, find his own spiritual path. He's a man who is deeply involved with his faith. He ties everything into his Christian philosophies, and particularly his knowledge of the Bible, which is quite deep. Now, these ideas are often issued with paradoxes as well. So, for instance, that death shall die is essentially not only humanizing death, but to say that death itself shall be something that's no more, because of the fact that his faith allows him to have almost a seamless transition, or that it's a smallish barrier between life and death, not this big one. So, to have those two things side by side sort of lessens the impact of death. And that's something that his faith allows him to do. The same as with the sun, that the sun, this big and almighty thing, can be eclipsed with something as simple as a man winking. Now, again, this is something to say, and yet he also says that this love is as powerful as the sun. So there's these paradoxes which are sort of weaved and sort of invites these sorts of questions, in that he believes himself powerful and yet completely and utterly powerless. He's a man who, I guess, operates in these paradoxes, in these contrasts. And certainly it's something that you'll see repeated, particularly for a lot of his poetry, and particularly those which question, and certainly those which indeed seek to explore and understand his faith. Okay, and as I said, he is a man who also greatly embraces his divine worship as well, and he's one who embraces God. This is a particularly strong quality of metaphysical poetry. And while one, I guess, challenging God doesn't necessarily make his poets or those branches of his poetry unmetaphysical, what it does do is it simply him exploring his love and his question of the divines in a sort of way which, again, is in its own way metaphysical. So they're both styles of metaphysical poetry, just approached in different ways. They are still, the one thing they still have in common is that they're both about his faith. They're both deeply romantic, and they are certainly ones where his faith in God and certainly his ideas about God were never to be challenged, never to be questioned. So this is where it's challenged less. It certainly does not suffer the same sort of attacks, and this is particularly his later work. He is one who, I guess, believes himself worthy of his divine affection, and to be, I guess, to be worthy of a spot in heaven. These reflect a more personal tone, and this is particularly in contrast to his vindictive personas and complex ones, such as in the apparition, for instance, where you've got a very complex and very vindictive, very angry sort of young man, compared to, I guess, his more mellow and certainly his more spiritual poems in something such as A Hymn to God, My God in My Sickness. You'll certainly find someone who is talking deeply from a personal level. And certainly there's no other way to, I guess, look at the poem. Certainly you look at it as a persona, but the voice you hear is pretty much Donne's. Now, in A Hymn to My God, as I said, this is a man awaiting peace. This is a man embracing his death. This is a man who is using the religious motifs, the ones that in his youth he would, I guess, tease a bit to I guess, almost beam him up, to accept him, to be like him, because soon he's going to be one with them. So by becoming a spirit, he's going to become one with these sorts of ideas and these divines. So as he's preparing for death, he starts to embrace all these things, and certainly embraces this this idea of a map, which is going to guide him to where he goes in his afterlife. And these poems, such as also at the Round Earth's Corners below, there is a connection between, I guess, Christ's second coming. So again, there's that embrace and that sort of that, I guess, that almost acid test that he sets himself, where he'd like to have his own soul cleansed, that he'd like to prove his worth. He'd like to prove himself a candidate worthy of a place in heaven, and certainly one who has embraced, has shown full love for his faith. Now, love as spiritual and as a physical concept is, again, one which is quite strongly and certainly one that's quite inherent in metaphysical poetry. Now, Donne explores this in two ways. First of all, I guess in the physical way, you would look at it in terms of his love and his love affairs. So in terms of his wife, in terms of his scores of lovers, supposedly however many there may have been, before the stage where he was married, and of course his spiritual love, his devotion to his faith. Now, I'm not saying that these would be compared in any way, certainly not, but the way that he's passionate about both, and certainly the way that his emotional energy is really invested in both, is one that is quite intrinsic to, I guess, the man that Donne is. And now he is a very passionate sort of man. So we see love as both physical and spiritual explored in very passionate, very deep ways. These are indeed ideas which are linked as well. Now, these aren't linked in the way that they're that he's sort of comparing love for God as love to a woman. He's comparing them in the sense that because of the fact that we are all spirits, and inside our spirits are all connected to each other, like we've got giant ropes between us. And because we're all connected to each other, because of all these ideas that we're connected to each other in life and in death as well, this is where this idea of we're connected by love, but we're also connected by our spirit as well. So that's where this sort of world overlaps a bit. In The Sun Rises as well, we see that the love takes on two different forms. There's the physical love, obviously the fact that he is with his lover, but also the spiritual one as well, that their bed is a divine place. That because of their, I guess, spiritual connection that they're having, they have become the center of the universe. They have become all that is important to him. And so, again, this idea of love as a physical and spiritual quality is explored in exactly the same place. So, we've got these two ideas sort of linked into one. So in The Sun Rising, we've essentially got love as a physical and as a spiritual concept being explored in exactly the same way. In The Relic, we see this, again, quite differently, where, in this case, instead of being a love, they're being lovers who are dead. Yet they're, again, connected in both the spiritual form and in the physical form. They're connected in the physical form as in their bones are buried together. However, they're connected in the spiritual form because of the fact that they are being worshipped, that their spirits are so in love that not only have their bodies been buried together, but they are completely together forever. And even the child, who we assume is, or who we could say is this moored one to the bed that the woman is referred to as being, we can see that they are all connected in such a strong spiritual manner. It's something that's being immortalized as being a divine relic and worthy of being divinely, I guess, worshipped. And certainly this is a very strong idea, which is also represented through these metaphors and analogies that Donne uses. Now, metaphors and analogies in Donne's poetry are ones which are often quite complex. They are ones which are repeated throughout, and they're certainly ones that are quite centered around religious philosophy. He uses his faith and he uses the world around him. Certainly, this was an age as well where science had started to really take hold, but they are ones where there were explorers crossing the oceans. There were things from new worlds being discovered and being brought back to England and being brought back to Europe and being great marvels. This is the time where certainly a lot of ships were discovering new lands, particularly America. And America was the hot topic, I guess, in European circles, where all these things have been discovered, and certainly a lot of new things had sort of come into the world. So there is this worldly experience that Donne as I guess seen, and also because of the fact he does go to Europe as well. So he is a man who has seen the world. Now, to start with, there are a lot of religious sort of obviously metaphors and analogies, which I'm not going to go into all of them. The most key one, I guess, is this idea of spheres, this idea of the Earth being the center of the universe. It's one which refers to essentially this idea that the Earth is the center of the universe, and this was a very strongly held belief at the time, that this idea, and certainly you would see that in the artwork to my right, where the Earth is the center, the planets all move around it, and it certainly reinforces, I guess, the power in which the human race, I guess, would have considered themselves of having, as being center of the universe, as the Earth being the center of all that's around them. There's this idea that we are masters of our own destiny, so to speak, and certainly this is an analogy which is something which is repeated throughout, particularly in a poem like The Sun Rising, for instance. He also uses a number of different analogies, and certainly he makes a lot of lists in his poems, particularly when he refers to death. He refers to things which are like death. So in Death Be Not Proud, he refers to death being similar to sleep, being similar to what poppies can do, similar to being a slave and all those things. So using those lists, using something like, for instance, at Earth's Round Corners Below, as again, you would see this idea as well as these people who have been certainly not only have faced many manners of death and therefore are worthy of being judged in different sorts of ways, but we also see it through the paradox he creates, through this idea of his blood and his connection to Christ. Another example as well is located in a hymn to God, my sickness, which refers to a number of different analogies, particularly about Adam and the crucifixion of Jesus being in the same place, the west being the direction of heaven, quietly singing. All of these things are tied into it, that they are the first sounds to greet those in heaven. So he's connecting this idea of heaven to all these spiritual guides and all these earthly things. So this is the world of theirs joining together. That all these things that he is expecting to encounter in death are exactly the same, almost, as things he's undergoing now, that his body being like a map is the same as the map that's going to take him to heaven. That this quietly singing that he used to hear in his church is going to be the same one that's going to greet him when he comes to heaven for the first time. So there's all these metaphors and particularly analogies which then sort of link those two ideas together. You also see that in Death Be Not Proud, and I mentioned this before, where one must not fear death. The afterlife is more beautiful than the horror of dying. And again, we get all those metaphors and analogies which, again, reflect this idea of that it's not so bad, that there are a number of things which are certainly not as terrifying as death, and death is just like those things. And we shouldn't fear death because death is seemingly peaceful. That if you see someone who is dead, they look at peace, that they don't look like they're afraid because they're lying there, they're looking like they're sleeping. Next one we're going to look at is women. Now, women are a very complex theme in Donne's poetry, and certainly they're a very interesting excerpt into the man. And certainly you'll notice that in poetry such as The Apparition and The Sun Rising, where there's a very explicit, and certainly he talks about his I guess, love affairs fairly explicitly for the time. Obviously he doesn't go into details, but the fact that he talks about him being next to, I guess, a lover in bed is almost explicit enough that he is talking about them basically the night after. That he's talking about them almost in a way where he puts himself higher that he puts himself in a godlike status, for which reason you could consider his poems to be, maybe rightfully so, misogynistic. Certainly it's not something that you would dwell on, particularly as his poems have a lot more of a emotional quality, and certainly this is probably inherent to the value systems that were particularly around men at the time. But this is one of those things that if you were to take a modern reading of it, and particularly the way that you would look at his attitudes towards women, there's certainly ones which are quite not only, I guess, complex, but they are one of those things that particularly when you look at his love affairs, you see his passion as well. You see his almost outspoken passion. And it's the same sort of passion which then comes across when you look at his religious poetry. Obviously, the two ideas are only linked by that idea of passion, but they are linked in such a way where we do get this sense that he is a very passionate man, and certainly his love affairs with women certainly indicate a man of great passion. In other poems, they do show a little bit more respectful, and they certainly are a less explicit side. They are talking about love being a forever and certainly an immortal thing. And certainly, as I said before, this is an idea you can tie into the religious aspect of Donne's poetry. That he has two great loves of his life. He loves God and he loves the women in his life. And certainly those are the two themes that stand out quite profoundly in his poetry. In a valediction, we see a union between love and between a man and a woman, even as they are apart even. So this is something where we see Donne certainly reaching an emotional maturity, and certainly this is almost blending the two things together, where we've got essentially poems which are placing a woman and the spirits, I guess, around Donne at the time, apart, whereas this one sort of brings them together and saying that by basically us being the perfect couple, by us being in love with each other, that our spirits are so connected in such a way where our love will continue in almost a physical form even if we aren't together. So we will follow each other everywhere, no matter even if we're not completely together. It's reflective of poems that Donne wrote after he became married, and certainly they take a lot more of a serious tone than perhaps his earlier work. And certainly if you're looking, I guess, at his attitudes towards women, he does appear to be a man who changes in later points of his life. However, as I said, this is not a point you would dwell upon immensely, but it's an idea that you can look at in his poetry. Now, death is something that is quite of a preoccupation for Donne. And it's something of, I guess, a meditation. It's one where there's no real morbid purpose. He's not gravedigger. I mean, he did obviously spend time as a duke of a church, so he was connected, I guess, to ideas of life and death quite frequently. However, this was more connecting this idea of the spirit and the soul, the human soul within us, to the spirit world, to the divine world. And so by having this fascination with death, he's basically fantasizing the moment where those two things join together, when the body's soul leaves the mortal flesh and then ascends to heaven, these sorts of things. And the fact that our destination is considered to be the afterlife. So this is why this idea of death comes into his poetry quite frequently. It's something that is meditative. It's something where he almost fantasizes that, yes, when I die, I will be going to heaven and it will be lovely. And it's something almost that he works towards throughout his life, is towards not only his faith, which I guess as a practicing Christian he must, but also to the fact that he believes that through his faith he will become a stronger person, and through the fact that his faith is relating to ideas where after death he will become one with the spirit world, certainly those ideas sort of come into one. And so while we may look at death and immediately insinuate that with, or at least have a connotation between death and misery, it's certainly not miserable poetry at all. And death be not proud, in fact it's belittled, he mocks it. And this is sort of showing, I guess, the power of the Christian faith. in the relic, where it's considered to have a permanent quality, as in death is something which at least allows a sort of eternal binding, where they are bound together eternally, is something which again sort of connects this idea and this particular meditative power of the spirits. He's trying to connect himself in the spirit world that he hopes will one day take him eternally, and that this life is short, this life is brief, but the afterlife is something which has a permanence to it that is never ending. And so certainly I guess he's preparing for that sense that it's just but a short bit before our longer lives begin. In the valediction, again we see a different view of death again, where separation is a kind of death. And again, this is sort of going back into that spiritual idea again. So, and when people depart, when people, I guess, say goodbye, and certainly that's what people do when a loved one passes, it's certainly one of those things where I guess the common line which comes after funerals, which is "Don't worry, they're in a better place." And certainly, I guess Donne was sort of hijacking that a little bit for his metaphor there. So again, there's that sort of idea that death is a better place almost than life. I wouldn't necessarily say that he was wishing for death, and certainly he wasn't one who sought death, but he's one who embraced the ideas that that death was going to be something that was going to tie his life together, that it was something where he would be finally connected to all these things he believed himself connected to. So certainly this idea of death is one that connects him to the world around him. Now, the structure of Donne's poetry is something also worthy of looking at, and certainly because one of the things about Donne's poetry is it's fairly chaotic. Now, this is for a number of different reasons. First of all, it's not really a traditional style. There are different sorts of rhyming sets, but it's mainly because of the fact that Donne's poetry is exclusively personal. These aren't written for a poetry society. This is written for himself. So when you see his poems, now yes, they are quite witty and extremely well put together, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they have to be structured in order to do so. And in fact, this poetry, in his sense, is not structured. That they are structured according to tone and content. And certainly he has a strong sense of style and is able to change the tone based on the structure he uses. He will change the rhyming set around. He will change the length of the stanzas and the couplets. He will change the couplets around completely. He will invent and switch the rhyming patterns. And again, this sort of helps to shape the different aspects of the same question, particularly of what it means to die. If you look at a number of different poems, you see that connection. So they change, they take different forms, such as rhyming couplets, for instance, and certainly the poems of Donne's that do rhyme, they don't rhyme in an even sort of way. They change with tone, the conventions of the poetry even changes, and certainly the language changes. Now, the language is again another feature that we need to sort of look at, because it not only varies in the techniques he uses, but also in the tone he uses. That paradoxes are commonly used, and the reason why is because of the fact that Donne's faith is something that is impossible and yet very simple to understand. It's simple to understand in the sense that he is in love with God, and yet it's impossible to understand because of so much uncertainty that goes with it. And so we see this paradox being, I guess, created because of the fact that he is quite, I guess, simple in his appraisal of how he loves God, but it's quite complex in the sense that it still puzzles him. The meaning of it still eludes him somewhat. We see that in The Round Earth's Corners Below, for instance, where we see Donne begging for forgiveness after he already has it. So he's a man who believes, yes, I will be forgiven, but he believes I still feel like I should earn it. It's something worthy of my powers as a Christian to earn. We'd see alliteration being used as something that adds a song quality or makes key ideas stand out. And particularly, it's one of those things that he uses quite frequently to sort of help bring out these key themes and certainly these dominant ideas. It makes a number of ironic statements to go with the paradoxes. For instance, in the sun rising, that the sun is the same thing that allows him to see his lover, is the same thing which he basically despises because it's ruining his night with her. So those sorts of ironic statements and paradoxes are ones which are sort of linked together, and it's one of, I guess, the witty and clever uses of language that he sort of specialises in. But the main way to look at Donne's poetry, and particularly Donne's language and structure, is that they are essentially geared towards developing an emotional reaction. Certainly, they're developing Donne's emotional attachment to not only the physical world, but the spiritual world. So when you analyse and interpret Donne's poetry, you're looking at basically a man whose divine and spiritual self is heavily mixed in with what he sees, what he does. And we also see that in the world that Donne lives, he is constantly challenging himself to, I guess, be sort of a very passionate observer of his faith. He challenges himself to be a passionate lover of the women he is with, and certainly his wife in his later poetry. And certainly we see this understanding of his faith, and certainly through his understanding of religious texts, that he really feels like he has developed, I guess, a connection with the afterlife that he will bind with forever. So when you're looking at it, you're looking at basically what images, what ideas, what metaphors and analogies which are being used to sort of bring those things out. And how does he bring these conceits into it, these ideas which are sort of admissions, which he then somewhat changes and alters as he looks deeper into it. And as his poems go deeper, they unlock more and more things. So that's basically it for critically and, well, interpretively analysing Donne's poetry. Certainly, it's one of those things that you don't allow yourself to be overburdened by it, and certainly you don't let the language fool you. By basically looking at the things that you feel out of it, and certainly looking at the sorts of values that you see in him, and certainly that passion is one of those values which is quite current throughout all of his work, then you're able to sort of dissect those sorts of things which make him sort of seem passionate. Certainly towards his attitudes towards women, his attitudes towards religion, his attitudes towards death. If you link all those things together, you will have something that is worthy for your response. And certainly you then target the question, target all these ideas which you will then explore, and certainly you'll be able to discuss in a lot of detail, as there are a number of different ideas, and you don't have to mention all of the layers in Donne's work, just a couple. So just peel off a few layers and you'll have everything that you'll need out of Donne, and certainly you'll have all the ideas you'll need to compose a thoughtful and very intelligent response. And that's all I have time for here. So until next time, I'll see you later.